There was a woman at the gathering who sat quietly in the corner, unnoticed by most. She wasn't the type to make a scene, never drawing attention to herself. She was the kind of person who faded into the background, letting others take the spotlight. She had always been that way, shy, reserved, and careful not to stand out. Despite this, there was something about her that was different from the rest of the crowd. It was her eyes, always observing, always deep in thought, but never truly engaging. It wasn't that she didn't want to be part of the conversation, but social situations had always felt like a challenge for her. The voices of others, loud and confident, seemed to fill the space around her, leaving her with little room to speak up. Every word she spoke felt like it would be drowned out by someone else's. Her body language reflected this quiet discomfort, her arms crossed, posture stiff, and her gaze often turned downward. She was comfortable in silence, but that didn't mean she didn't long for connection. Her passion, however, was something that went unnoticed by the busy, talkative crowd around her. She had always been drawn to the piano. The keys were like her silent companions, the only place where she could truly express herself without fear of judgment or interruption. The piano had been her refuge for as long as she could remember, her one true escape from the world of expectations and noise. She would sit for hours, her fingers dancing across the keys, playing melodies that told stories of joy, sadness, hope, and dreams, emotions that she couldn't express with words. But she was scared of what people might think if she were to play in front of others. She feared that if they saw her, they would see only her quiet, awkward self. They wouldn't see the music, they wouldn't see the heart and soul she poured into every note, they wouldn't understand. And so, she kept her music to herself. As she sat in the corner, she watched others laugh and chat freely. The party was full of lively conversation, each person easily slipping into the social flow. They were confident, secure in themselves, and they didn't mind the spotlight. She felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. She thought about getting up and joining the group. She wasn't sure what to say or how to enter the conversation without feeling awkward. Her fingers twitched slightly as she glanced toward the piano. The sound of its polished keys seemed to call out to her, drawing her in like a magnet. She had heard someone mention the piano earlier in passing, but the group had dismissed it as just an item of decoration. "Oh, it's just there for show," someone had said. "I don't think anyone plays it." The woman's heart sank as she overheard those words. The piano for her was more than just an object. It was a piece of her talent, her passion, her voice. But to everyone else, it was just a piece of furniture, another decoration in a room full of distractions. That was the way it always felt. What she valued was often overlooked by others. The piano was sitting silently now, waiting, like a secret kept in the room. She had always dreamed of playing it in front of others, but the thought of doing so filled her with fear. What if they didn't like her music? What if they didn't care? What if they laughed at her? She imagined walking over to it, sitting down, and then nothing. The silence that would follow after her first note, the tension that would fill the room would be unbearable. She sighed, folding her hands in her lap. The world felt so loud around her, yet in that moment, everything seemed distant. It was as if she was watching the scene unfold from afar, a silent observer in her own life. Wondered if anyone noticed her at all, but quickly pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. She had always been content with being invisible. It was easier that way. But there was a part of her that wasn't content. A part of her that yearned to be seen. A part of her that dreamed of standing in front of others, her hands on the piano keys, filling the air with the music that had always lived inside her. But that part was buried deep inside, hidden behind layers of self-doubt and fear. The night dragged on as she sat there, lost in her thoughts. The conversations around her continued to swirl, but she wasn't part of them. She felt like an outsider, a guest in her own life. And yet, her eyes kept drifting toward the piano. It was like a quiet invitation, an opportunity waiting for her to take it, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her fingers rested lightly on her lap, tapping to a rhythm only she could hear. The music in her mind was already playing, filling the silence around her. It was beautiful, gentle, and hopeful, but she couldn't bring herself to share it. Not here, not now. Maybe someday. she thought. Maybe someday she would find the courage, but for now, she stayed in her corner, invisible, silent. Her music locked away inside her heart, waiting for the moment when she would be ready to share it with the world. The party was in full swing. Laughter echoed through the grand mansion, and the clinking of glasses blended with the soft hum of conversation. The house was filled with people who seemed to move with ease, their words flowing effortlessly as they mingled and made connections. It was a world the woman had never quite understood, this world where socializing felt as natural as breathing, where small talk came easily, and every interaction seemed like a carefully choreographed dance. She watched it all from her quiet corner, feeling like an outsider, as if the room was made for everyone except her. The people around her laughed and spoke in groups, swapping stories and discussing the latest news.
Nice.
They were confident, assertive, their presence undeniable. It was as if they had been born for these kinds of events where everyone had their place, their role, and their voice. But she didn't have a role here. She wasn't the type to make waves or insert herself into conversations. She had never been good at being noticed. She felt out of place, like a shadow moving through the crowd. Always at the edges, never quite fitting in. Her mind drifted back to her own thoughts. It was strange how, despite all the noise and bustle around her, she felt so isolated. In the midst of all these people, she was still invisible. No one paid her much attention. It wasn't out of malice or indifference. It was simply that she didn't stand out. People didn't notice her because she didn't ask them to. She had learned long ago that blending into the background was the safest way to survive social events like this. It was easier that way, but tonight the atmosphere felt different. The mansion seemed alive with energy, the kind of energy that made everything feel bigger and more important. As she sat there, lost in the chaos of conversations and laughter, she couldn't help but feel the pull of something deep inside her, a quiet, persistent yearning to break free from the shadows. Her gaze flicked to the piano in the corner of the room. It had been placed there with the elegance of an object meant to be admired from afar. The gleaming keys, the polished wood, the ornate carvings around the edges, all of it seemed to call to her. Like a moth to a flame. The piano was her refuge, her silent sanctuary. It had been a part of her for as long as she could remember, an instrument that could speak when her words failed her. But it wasn't just any piano, it was a grand piano. It's the kind you saw in concert halls or upscale events. It was the kind of instrument that demanded attention. Tonight, it was completely ignored. No one seemed to care about it, and that made her feel even more uncertain. She had heard someone mention it earlier. It's a fleeting comment in the background, but it had been dismissed with a wave. "Oh, it's just there for decoration," someone had said. The words stung, even though they weren't directed at her. The piano, so important to her, was nothing more than an afterthought to them. She wondered if they even realized how beautiful it was, how much potential it held. The air in the room seemed to thicken with a sense of longing. The voices around her blurred into an indistinct murmur, and all she could hear was the soft melody in her mind. It wasn't a song she had written, but a rhythm that had been with her for years, her heartbeat, the pulse of her life. The same rhythm that played whenever she sat at the piano, when her fingers danced across the keys, when the music flowed from her soul. But how could she bring that music into this world? How could she share something so personal in a place where she didn't even feel like she belonged? The thought of getting up and walking toward the piano, of sitting down in front of everyone, terrified her. What if they didn't like it? If they laughed or mocked her? The fear crept up her spine like a cold chill, paralyzing her with doubt. For a moment, she closed her eyes, blocking out the noise of the room. She could almost see herself at the piano, her fingers moving with grace and confidence. She could hear the music filling the air, weaving through the space like a thread, drawing everyone's attention. But it was only a fantasy, a dream she wasn't brave enough to pursue. As she sat there, the thought lingered, what if this time was different? What if she found the courage to step forward, to take the risk? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. It would take everything she had to overcome the wall of fear that had held her back for so long. But the pull was undeniable, stronger than the noise around her. And then, as if to answer her unspoken question, the sound of the piano filled the air. The distant, soft chord rang out like a single, lonely note in the midst of the chaos. It wasn't anyone else playing. It was just the echo of the possibilities in her mind, the whisper of something she could do, something that could change everything. Her heart raced. And for the first time in the evening, she felt something stir deep inside her, a flicker of hope, a spark of courage. Maybe it was time to stop being the observer, to stop blending into the background. Maybe it was time to take her place at the piano. The piano in the corner, the soft clink of a glass, breaking the noise of the party, jolted her from her thoughts. But she didn't look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the piano, now seeming almost like an island in a sea of chatter and laughter. It stood there, nestled in the far corner of the room, untouched by any of the guests, a silent invitation for someone to come and play. To most, it was nothing more than a piece of furniture, decorative item that added elegance to the space but had no real purpose. Yet for her, it was so much more. The grand piano called to her in a way words couldn't describe. It's ivory. Keys gleamed under the soft light, reflecting the world around it. But they seemed to promise something greater, something she had always longed for. It was as if the piano knew her secret, understood her desire to be seen and heard, but only on her terms. To play it was to release everything hidden inside, to let the music speak for her when words could never capture the depth of her emotions. But fear kept her rooted in place. Her fingers, which had once danced over the keys with fluidity and grace, now twitched nervously at her sides.
Oh.
The soft melody she had practiced alone in her room now felt like a distant echo, out of reach in the middle of the crowded room. What if they don't care? She wondered. What if I ruin it? It would be so easy to slip away, to quietly leave the gathering and retreat to the safety of her solitude. The party would go on, and no one would notice. The piano would stay silent just like her, forgotten by all but the few who might have even bothered to look at it. But something was different tonight. Something inside her stirred a quiet strength that had been building ever since she walked into this room, unnoticed, blending into the background. As much as she tried to push it away, the piano in the corner kept calling to her. The music inside her felt too strong to keep hidden any longer. Her eyes traveled over the piano, taking in the delicate carvings along its edges, the polished wood that seemed to shimmer in the low light. She could almost hear the first note echoing in her mind. The sound would fill the room like a wave, pushing aside the noise and the doubt. For once, she imagined herself stepping up to the keys, her hands lifting, and with a deep breath, starting to play. But the thought made her pulse race, her stomach churn with anxiety. The idea of everyone watching her, of those polished faces, around her turning their gaze toward her in surprise, was almost too much to bear. What if they didn't like it? What if they judged her? In the comfort of her room, she had played freely, letting her heart flow through every note. In front of strangers, the stakes felt higher. As if on cue, a group of people walked by, laughing and chatting. One of them glanced at the piano and casually remarked, "Piano's a nice touch, but I don't think anyone's brave enough to play it tonight." The words were dismissive, almost too casual, as though the piano was just another piece of the furniture. She felt her face flush, and for a moment she shrank back, ready to retreat into the corner again to disappear. But then something in her shifted. The words of the group no longer stung as much. They didn't understand. How could they? The piano wasn't just an object. It was an extension of herself. It was her voice, her heart, her emotions all contained in those delicate keys. The thought of leaving the room, of never taking the opportunity to play, felt heavier than the fear she had been carrying all night. She thought about the years she had spent playing alone, the hours spent perfecting each piece, the quiet joy that filled her when she was at the piano. How many moments had she let slip by, telling herself that she wasn't ready, that the world wasn't ready to hear her music? What if this was the moment? Her fingers itched again, as though the piano was calling to them, urging them to move. It was an irrational thought, but in that fleeting instant, it felt right. She could almost feel the cool ivory of the keys beneath. Her fingertips, the weight of each note that would fill the room with something beautiful, something that didn't need approval or validation, but simply needed to be. She stood up slowly as if waking from a dream. For the first time, her movements felt deliberate, not hesitant. Each step she took toward the piano felt like a small victory, a challenge to the doubts that had held her back for so long. As she reached the piano, her hand hovered over the keys, and she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The noise of the party seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the anticipation in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. The first note would be the hardest. It always was. But she couldn't let fear stop her now. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The room, which had felt so loud and crowded moments before, became still. For just a second, everything was quiet, waiting. Then, with a soft press, her first note rang out, clear and pure. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to pause. The dismissive group, the sound of her first note hung in the air. Delicate yet powerful, like the softest whisper in a room full of noise. She wasn't sure if anyone had noticed yet, but she knew the next moment would decide everything. She wasn't sure what she expected, perhaps a gasp, perhaps an immediate wave of appreciation, maybe even an uncomfortable silence. But instead there was just the faint echo of her note fading into the background. Swallowed up by the distant chatter of the partygoers, her fingers hovered over the keys for a second longer, and then she hesitated. What had she expected? Applause? Recognition? She felt the weight of her own insecurity pressing against her chest. She stole a quick glance around the room, her heart pounding in her ears, but no one was paying attention. The loud laughter of the group by the punch bowl, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversations, they all continued without missing a beat. A man in the corner, or with a drink in his hand, glanced briefly at her and then back to the crowd. "I don't know why they even have a piano here. It's just for decoration," he said, loud enough for her to hear, his voice thick with indifference. His words were as dismissive as the glance he had cast her way. She froze. Her fingers felt cold. Against the keys, her heart sinking. She had hoped so naively that her music might have stirred something. Instead, she was just another part of the background noise. A few more people around the room joined in the casual conversation, and no one made a move toward the piano. It was as if the space she had dared to fill with music was simply irrelevant. She could feel the weight of their disinterest, how little they cared about her presence, about her attempt to share something personal. It hurt more than she expected. She thought that playing, even for just a moment, would have been her way of breaking free, of proving something to herself. But now, sitting at the piano, she realized just how invisible she was in this crowd. To them, the piano wasn't an instrument of expression or beauty, was merely an ornament. The group near the punch bowl continued their loud conversation, laughing at an offhand comment someone made, oblivious to the woman in the corner, her hands resting on the keys. One of them even mocked the idea of playing music in such a social setting. "Who needs a piano in a room full of people, right?" They laughed, unaware of how deeply it stung. For a moment, she considered standing up, leaving the piano, and sinking back into the shadows where no one would notice her. It would be easier, safer. The silence would swallow her back up, and she could pretend the moment never happened. But as she glanced down at her hands, resting on the keys, something inside her stirred. This isn't just about them, she realized. This is about me. She had spent her life blending into the background, never stepping forward, never showing her true self. She had let fear hold her back, let the voices of others define her worth. But now, as her fingers rested on the piano, she felt something else, a quiet resistance, a determination that had been building for years, hidden beneath the layers of self-doubt. A part of her wanted to play louder, to force her music into the space, to demand attention. But the idea of doing that felt just as terrifying as the fear she had already conquered. Instead, she took a breath and decided to focus on something simple, the music. Not for them, not to impress anyone, but for herself. She pressed her fingers gently into the keys again, and this time, the sound that emerged was softer, almost timid, an echo of the music she had practiced over countless lonely nights. The melody wasn't forceful or bold. It wasn't an attempt to claim the room. It was just a part of her, flowing out in a way that felt pure and honest. Her hands moved with fluidity, her heart steadying with every note. She didn't need the approval of the group, or anyone for that matter. The music was hers to give, not to earn praise. And for the first time, the weight of their dismissal didn't matter. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for herself. As her song continued to fill the room, faint whispers of the music began to reach a few of the guests nearby. Soft notes lingered in the air, and slowly a shift began. The laughter softened, the chatter slowed. People started to glance over their shoulders, drawn in by the unexpected sound in the room. But she didn't look up. She focused on the piano, her fingers dancing over the keys, pouring her thoughts into the melody. With each passing second, the noise around her began to fade into the background. It was just her and the music now. And in that quiet space, she realized that her courage, no matter how small, was all she truly needed. The moment of courage, as the music continued to flow from her fingers, she felt the room shift around her. It was subtle at first, like the faintest ripple across the surface of a still pond. The conversations, which had once filled the air with their constant hum, gradually began to fade. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, the idle chatter, all of it seemed to recede into the distance, as if her music was gently pushing it away. But she wasn't looking at them. She couldn't. Not yet. Her focus remained firmly on the keys in front of her. Each note she played both a release and a reflection of her inner world. There was no rush, no pressure. For the first time that night, she felt at peace. Her hands moved with an ease she hadn't anticipated. The anxiety that had gripped her earlier, that had nearly held her back from even starting, seemed to evaporate. The music wasn't just a series of notes, it was a conversation. She could feel it. Feel the way each chord carried a message, a story. A fragment of herself she had been too afraid to share. But then, for a fleeting second, doubt crept back in. What if they think I'm not good enough, she thought. What if I'm not enough to hold their attention? The fear of rejection that had haunted her for so long flared up again, threatening to pull her out of the moment. She wanted to stop, to stand up and leave the piano, return to the safety of her corner. But something inside her refused to let go. It was like a whisper, soft, but persistent, reminding her of everything she had overcome to get here. This isn't just about them, it said. It's about you. You are worthy of being heard. It was a small, quiet voice, but it was enough to give her the courage to press on. Her fingers, trembling slightly, continued their dance across the keys. The melody took on a new life, a rhythm that grew stronger with every note, every passing second. It was as though the music itself had become an extension of her resolve, carrying her beyond the realm of self-doubt and into a space of pure expression. She had done it. She had taken that first step. She had sat down at the piano, placed her fingers on the keys, and shared a piece of herself with the room. Now it was time to finish what she had started. Without looking up, without even thinking about the people around her, she played. The sound was soft but undeniable. It wove through the room like a thread slowly tying the pieces of her experience. Together, there was no grand gesture, no flashy display of skill. It was simple, raw, and beautiful in its quiet authenticity. Each note was a message. I am here. I have something to offer. And I am worthy of being seen. And then, slowly, she became aware of the shift happening around her. It wasn't just the subtle change in the air. It was the way the room had started to quieten even more. The laughter had faded, replaced by a hushed anticipation. People were moving closer, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. They were listening, really listening to the music that had begun to take over the space. Her heart quickened as she realized it wasn't just her music anymore. It was something more. Something that was transcending her initial fear and anxiety. The room wasn't just filled with notes. It was filled with possibility. She could feel the eyes on her now, but instead of freezing up in panic, she let it happen. She welcomed it. She had faced the fear of being invisible, of being ignored, and now she was feeling the power of being seen. It's not for her appearance or the stories she could tell, but for the music she had shared, a voice that had until this moment been locked away. She pressed on, her fingers flowing with newfound confidence. Every note seemed to connect with someone, as though the music was speaking directly to their hearts. A few people had gathered around the piano now, standing in silence, captivated by what they were hearing. One person, a woman near the back of the room, had tears in her eyes. Another man, previously talking loudly to a friend, had stopped mid-sentence to listen. The applause she had once feared didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about applause. It wasn't about validation. It was about the feeling of the moment, the pure, unfiltered release of her soul through music. And as the final note of her song resonated through the room, the last chord hung in the air, delicate and clear. There was a brief silence, a deep, lingering stillness that felt like the world had paused, holding its breath. And then, slowly, the room erupted into applause. But this time, it wasn't the kind of applause that felt like an obligation. It wasn't forced or polite. It was real. It was genuine. It was the kind of applause that comes when something true, something raw, touches everyone in the room. She stood there, her hands resting gently on the piano, still in shock that she had done it. That she had overcome the voice of doubt, the weight of insecurity, and shared a part of herself so openly. And as the applause washed over her, she realized something powerful. She wasn't just a woman at a party. She was someone who had something meaningful to share. Someone who had found the courage to be seen. The transformation, the applause rippled through the room. But to her surprise, it wasn't deafening. It wasn't loud or overpowering. It was something softer, something quieter, an acknowledgement of the subtle power in the air. It felt like a gentle wave washing over her, lifting her from the place where she had been hiding for so long. She sat there, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Was this real? Was she really being applauded? Room, expecting to find a group of people politely clapping because they felt obligated. But that wasn't it. The faces around her were not just giving praise, they were moved. Some were smiling, some were looking at her with wide, almost surprised eyes. They hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected it either. One of the men near the punch bowl, the one who had dismissed the piano as nothing more than a decorative piece, now stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. His face, usually so confident and dismissive, was now soft with surprise. He looked at her as if he had just realized something he had missed entirely. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a shift in the room that he couldn't ignore. The woman standing beside him, who had been laughing loudly just moments before, now looked at her with a kind of quiet reverence, her eyes wide with the realization that something extraordinary had just happened. She had been a part of the crowd, the noise, the chaos, but now, for the first time that night, she was seeing, and she wasn't alone. Everyone around her was seeing. It was like the room had collectively held its breath, and now, finally, they were releasing it together. The transformation wasn't just about the music hit, was about something deeper. The people around her were no longer the loud, busy, dismissive crowd she had entered with. They had become a group of individuals, each quietly processing what had just occurred. Something about the vulnerability in her music had cracked open the surface of the evening, and now the room felt different. People were not just talking, they were reflecting, listening, feeling. She looked down at her hands, still resting lightly on the piano keys. Felt strange, as if they didn't quite belong to her anymore, as though they had been transformed. In the act of creating something that no one expected, in that moment, she realized that this was the first time in her life she had truly allowed herself to be seen, not just physically, but emotionally, through her art. She had taken the leap and shared something so fragile and personal, and it had connected with the people around her in a way she never thought possible. Her mind raced with thoughts, but they were no longer filled with fear. They weren't clouded with doubts. Instead, she felt a quiet pride swelling within her, a sense of being grounded in a truth she had always known, but had been too afraid to embrace. She didn't need to be like everyone else. She didn't need to speak in the same loud, assertive way to be heard. She didn't need to change who she was. The music had done it for her. The group began to gather around the piano, some standing awkwardly, others leaning in closer. trying to get a better view of the woman who had transformed the room with a few simple chords. Their attention was no longer a weight, it was a gift. She no longer felt like an outsider trying to fit in. She was part of something, now a group of people who had shared a fleeting, profound moment of connection. Someone she wasn't sure who finally spoke, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. "That was incredible," they said, their voice softer than before. "I didn't know." Sentence trailed off, unfinished, but the meaning was clear. They hadn't known she had this talent, this ability to captivate. They hadn't known her at all. They had seen her as just another face in the crowd, just another quiet observer. But now they were seeing something entirely new. Another voice joined in. "You should play more often," they said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You have a gift." The words wrapped around her like a blanket, and they weren't empty compliments. They weren't patronizing. They were sincere, grounded in the recognition of something real. Her hands began to relax, and she felt a warmth spread across her chest. "They see me," she thought. "They really see me." The party continued, but the energy had shifted. The laughter wasn't as loud now, nor the conversations as scattered. People moved around her, but with a newfound respect, a curiosity about the woman who had surprised them all. It was no longer the loud, boisterous gathering it had been when she first entered. The chaos had quieted, and in its place there was an openness, a willingness to connect beyond the surface. For the first time in a long time, she felt a part of something bigger than herself. It wasn't about fitting in. It wasn't about conforming to anyone's expectations. It was about finding the courage to be seen, to express herself in a way that felt right, no matter how quiet or unassuming it may have seemed. And in that moment, as she sat at the piano, surrounded by the very people who had once ignored her, she realized something profound. She had always belonged. She had simply needed to find the courage to show up, to step into the room, to press her fingers to the keys, and to let the music speak louder than her fears. The transformation wasn't just in them, it was in her too. Applause. The room, still buzzing with the quiet hum of whispered conversations, seemed to lean in toward her. The atmosphere had shifted, and it wasn't just because the music had stopped. It was something deeper, something that rippled through the crowd, like the aftermath of a storm that had cleared the air, leaving everything crisp and expectant. She had been here before, at the edges, invisible, hiding behind her own walls. But this time, she was different. She wasn't standing back, waiting to blend into the background. She wasn't retreating into her corner. She was here, and she was seen. And that realization, simple as it was, sent a wave of warmth through her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel out of place. She didn't feel like a shadow. Her hands were still on the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, almost as if the music hadn't entirely left her. The room was waiting. She could feel it. They weren't just waiting for her to speak or make a move. They were waiting for her to be, to exist in a way she had never let herself before. The man who had mocked the piano earlier stepped closer, his posture more respectful now. His expression softened. He cleared his throat awkwardly, as if unsure of what to say. Then, with a hesitant smile, he simply said, "You should play more often." His words weren't forced, and they weren't meant to be kind or polite. They were genuine. He was acknowledging something he had missed, the beauty that had been right in front of him the entire time. And then it happened. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first. A few quiet claps here and there, like the beginning of a storm that you can hear in the distance, but don't yet feel. She was still holding her breath, unsure of how to react. But as the rhythm of the applause grew, so did the realization that this was real. She wasn't dreaming. They weren't clapping out of politeness. They were clapping because they were moved, because she had touched them. The soft sounds of hands coming together filled the space, growing louder with each passing second. She looked around, her heart beating in her ears, and for a brief moment the world felt entirely still. The applause surrounded her, enveloping her like a blanket, but it wasn't just for the music. It was for her, the woman, who had come from the shadows, who had braved her own fears, and who had shared something true. She looked up at the group, now gathered around her, some of them with tears in their eyes, others with wide, stunned expressions. They were seeing her not as the shy, quiet observer they had dismissed earlier, but as someone who had something powerful and unique to offer. For the first time, her music had opened a door, not just to them, but to herself as well. One woman stepped forward, her voice calm and full of admiration. "That was beautiful," she said softly, as if afraid to break the moment. "You have such a gift." Her words weren't the kind of compliment meant to smooth over an awkward situation. They weren't the kind of words people use to fill the silence after a performance. No, these words were an acknowledgement, a recognition of something deeper than just the notes that had filled the air. It was a recognition of the courage it took to share her art, to stand in front of them when every instinct screamed for her to run and hide. The applause continued, but it didn't feel like it was just for her performance. It was for the quiet bravery that had led her here. It was for the small victories, the moments when she had stepped outside of herself, when she had allowed her vulnerability to show. It was for the silent woman who had stood at the edge of the crowd, too afraid to speak, and had become the center of attention not by force, but by simply being her true self. And then the man who had first dismissed the piano, who had called it just for decoration, came forward. He extended a hand, not with a smug grin, but with a genuine smile. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken respect. "That was incredible." She took his hand, her fingers trembling, not from fear but from the sudden weight of everything that had just changed. It wasn't just the applause or the words of praise. It wasn't even the way the crowd had gathered around her now, showing an interest they hadn't before. It was the fact that she had found the courage to speak in the one way she had always kept silent through her music. In the back of her mind, she had always feared that her quiet nature would be her undoing, that it would keep her from ever truly connecting with others. But now, as the applause echoed around her, she realized that sometimes silence holds the most power. Sometimes it is the quiet ones who have the most to say. The applause slowly began to fade, but the feeling remained like the echo of a song that continues to hum long after the music stops. And for the first time that night, she didn't feel like she needed to run, to hide, or to shrink back. She had played her part. She had shared a piece of herself with the world, and for the first time, the world had truly seen her. And in that moment, she knew this was only the beginning. The silent understanding as the last of the applause began to fade into soft murmurs. The room seemed to return to its natural rhythm, but it was no longer the same. The energy that had once felt chaotic and distant was now filled with a kind of shared intimacy, like the collective breath of everyone in the room had been held and released together. Conversations resumed, but there was an unspoken change in the air, a subtle shift in how people looked at her. She didn't have to hear the compliments or the praise anymore. The way the crowd now regarded her was enough. Their eyes spoke volumes. There was something in the way they looked at her that wasn't just admiration, it was respect. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't just the shy woman who had retreated into the background. She had become something more in their eyes. She had become real. A few people came forward to speak to her, each one hesitant at first, unsure how to start a conversation after the intense moment of her performance. It felt natural, as if they were all finally seeing one another for the first time, not just through the lenses of small talk and pretense, but as people, authentic, vulnerable, and full of untold stories. One woman, the same one who had earlier been laughing loudly with her group, now stood quietly beside her. "I had no idea," she said, her voice quieter than before. I never would have guessed. You have an incredible talent." The sincerity in her tone was different from the casual praise others had offered. There was something in her eyes, a recognition that went beyond just music. But it wasn't the words that mattered the most. It was the silent understanding that had formed between them. The woman wasn't just complimenting her music, she was acknowledging the bravery it took to step forward. She was seeing the courage it had taken for the quiet woman to reveal a part of herself that had been hidden for so long. Across the room, another guest, who had been one of the most outspoken critics of the piano earlier, now stood at a distance, watching her with an expression that was harder to read. He didn't approach her, but his eyes were steady, thoughtful. There was a weight to his gaze, as if he was reconsidering everything he thought he knew about her, about the situation, and about the music. He wasn't clapping anymore, but there was something deeper in his silence, something that spoke more than any words could. It was respect. She caught his eye for a brief moment, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, a recognition that she had proven something not to him or anyone else, but to herself. In his quiet stare, there was a quiet shift in the room. She had not just played music, she had transformed the space. The piano, once dismissed as a mere decoration, had become the bridge between who she was and who she was becoming in this moment. But even as the room around her continued to buzz, she found herself stepping back into the quiet. She was still the woman who had always shied away from the limelight. She was still the woman who had spent years with her thoughts and her music as her only companions, but now there was a new kind of confidence in her silence. A confidence that didn't need to fill every space with words or actions. She had simply let the music speak for her. And in doing so, she had changed everything. She returned to her seat, not out of embarrassment or retreat, but because she knew the power of stillness. Her hands rested in her lap, but the silence didn't feel heavy. Now it felt light, like an empty canvas waiting to be filled with new stories, new experiences, and new possibilities. The room had quieted down, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that follows after. Something real has been shared, a moment of mutual understanding, something profound that had been unlocked by a simple, honest expression. The music had done the work, and now she was simply letting the quiet wash over her. The applause had faded, but it no longer mattered. She had faced her fear. She had stepped into the light and shared her soul with the world. And that was all she needed. She looked around once more, and this time, instead of feeling like an outsider, she felt like she was part of the room, part of the story. The party continued, but she no longer needed to search for her place in it. She had already found it. The night wasn't about the music anymore. It wasn't about being seen or praised. It was about a moment in time when she had allowed herself to be real, to speak through something other than words, and in doing so, had forged an unspoken connection with everyone around her. And in that unspoken understanding, she found something more powerful than applause, the quiet, undeniable certainty that she had finally, fully arrived. The new beginning. The evening wound down, the music and the laughter of the crowd now replaced by a gentle hum as people began to drift towards the exit, their conversations quieter, more thoughtful than before. But for the woman at the piano, the night felt endless. Like the last note of her song was still reverberating in the air, carrying with it everything she had left unsaid and everything she had just discovered about herself. She sat there, her fingers resting lightly on the piano keys, no longer feeling the weight of the crowd's attention, but rather a deep, satisfying silence. The kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but comforting, a space where everything felt balanced, where she didn't have to prove anything to anyone, not even herself. As the guests slowly trickled out, a few lingered behind, hesitant to break the stillness she had created, unsure of how to leave this new version of her behind. She glanced up as one of the guests, the man who had dismissed the piano earlier, approached her again. This time, his expression was different. There was no cocky indifference, no quick judgment. It's just an openness she hadn't seen before. He stood there for a moment, not speaking, just looking at her, as if deciding what to say. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice quieter than before. "You made this night something more than I expected." She smiled softly, her fingers still resting on the keys, but not playing. There was no need for more words. What had been said in the music was enough. The rest was just noise. He nodded, giving her one last meaningful glance before turning to join the others. She watched him leave, but instead of feeling dismissed or invisible as she had once feared, she felt something else, a gentle satisfaction. It wasn't about being acknowledged by everyone. It was about being able to stand in her own truth without the need for validation. The final guests slowly made their way to the door, and the mansion grew quieter, the echo of their footsteps fading into the night. Yet she didn't feel the familiar rush of loneliness she once had when events like this ended. Instead, there was peace in the stillness, a calm that settled in her chest as she allowed herself to simply exist in the moment. For the first time in a long time, She didn't feel like running away, retreating into the corners of the room, or melting into the background. She felt present, truly present in a way that was powerful, not because of the applause or the attention, but because she had allowed herself to show up in a way that felt true to who she was. She had played from the depths of herself, and it had been enough. Nell. And in that silence, she realized something. She had been waiting her entire life for permission to be herself, but tonight, she had finally given it to herself. No longer did she need the applause or the validation to feel worthy. The act of stepping forward, of revealing herself through her music, had been her own permission slip. She had opened herself up to the world, and instead of breaking her, it had connected her to something bigger, something she couldn't fully understand but felt deep within. She looked around the empty room. The piano was still there, silent, but no longer just an ornament or a symbol of her fear. It was an extension of her voice, her strength, her truth. It had become her ally, and in playing it, she had learned something vital. The true power of being seen isn't in how others respond to you. It's in how you respond to yourself. She stood up slowly, her body tired from the emotional weight of the night, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She didn't need to be noticed by everyone anymore. What mattered was that she had noticed herself, that she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, to share, to connect, and most importantly, to be heard. As she made her way to the door, she felt the cool night air brush against her skin, the weight of the evening settling comfortably within her. She no longer felt like the shy woman who had walked into this event, unsure and invisible. She felt like someone new, someone who had stepped into her own story, who had claimed her own voice. And as the door clicked shut behind her, she knew this was just the beginning. The applause had faded, but the change inside her had only just begun. Her music had not only filled the room, it had filled a space within herself that she had kept hidden for too long. And now, it would continue to echo, guiding her as she moved forward into the next chapter of her life. Confident, powerful, and ready to be seen for exactly who she was. A new journey had begun, and this time she was ready to embrace it fully.